So I guess I had no audio in the beginning, and hopefully I'll go back and cut that out. Anyway, what I was saying was 12,000 years ago, an organized group in southeastern Anatolia began construction on a project that seemingly changed the nature of the world order. Prior to that, as far as we know, the earth was inhabited by hunter gatherers. And some instances of semi sedentism are there to be found in the Near East, like the Natufians. They built pretty much permanent structures. They didn't necessarily inhabit them year round, but these were fixtures in the environment. At towns like Murriabet and similar early Neolithic settlements. There's some examples from southern Egypt, so the upper Nile region. I think it's called the Halaf culture, where they were grinding grains, they had ample food supplies, and there was probably semi-sedentism there, or maybe even full, sedentary habitation. In Ukraine, there's some examples from the Mesolithic, and then as far back as the Upper Paleolithic in the Gravettian period at Dolny Vestanich, somewhere in Central Europe. I forget what country. Anyway, so, there are precedents to this, but with Göbekli Tepe, you get a package of domestication events. Einkorn wheat is present wild near Göbekli Tepe, and it seems like it was domesticated around the time that Göbekli Tepe was built. We're talking probably around 10,000 BC or 9,500, confirmed more or less by carbon dating. So this was a change in the world order. This was a new world order, and it was brought about by an organized group that brought together a package of technologies, figured out how to integrate this package of technologies into a new social order, and then colonization began. It wasn't an organic growth. That's probably the biggest change in human life that we're aware of. Now I have my own speculation as to what happened before this event, before Göbekli Tepe. Were there antecedents that we're not aware of? Would this equate to something like Plato's myth of Atlantis, an advanced lost civilization? Researchers like Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson and that crowd, and Robert Schoch, who was one of the geologists who put forward this early dating of the Sphinx. So there's a group of researchers out there today who says there's growing evidence that precursors to civilization go back much further than we're used to considering. But Göbekli Tepe is the first really hard dating we have. And if you look at the subsequent history of the Neolithic, this was an organized event. A major change in the world order. And it probably came along with a religious change. So just, keep track of the key ingredients here. A package of new technologies, an organized group, probably hierarchical. That means control of and dissemination of resources and some kind of worldview, some kind of religion to hold it all together. The next time we see a comparable change, I know, Holt, it does seem like it came from nowhere. I don't think it came from nowhere. There must have been something before it. But on the stage of history, this is a new world order. Now, around 3000 BC, we have the beginning of the Akkadian Empire, the dynastic period in Egypt. This is preceded by civilization. It's just that this is when a new imperial phase of civilization begins. But it's really a steady growth from the early agricultural settlements in the Near East down through the, we're talking about like the Uruk phase at the later end, and then right after the Uruk phase, you have dynastic Sumer, I guess. But anyway, this is a comparable shift, and it coincides with the Bronze Age, right? A new technology. Now, it's nothing like the shift that took place with the introduction of agriculture, but around 5000, maybe sometime in that millennium, 5000 BC, you have intentional irrigation, where people are digging canals, and this opens up new possibilities of exploiting now arable land. So you can increase the population, you can control the food, control the technology that allows for the food production, and this is kind of one of those accelerants that led to this possibility of empire, where you have a coordinated group controlling the necessary resources for a massive population. Bronze technology really just adds a little bit of this kind of militaristic potential. So now a trained army of, say, a few thousand footmen, and later you get the chariots, and that changes things again. A new order is kind of brought about by that and the introduction of the Indo-Europeans into the scene. But primarily, I'm talking about this shift into the dynastic phase, where you have the possibility of professional militias controlling the food production and transportation of very large populations. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people in a fairly restricted area. Like Uruk had a population of around 40,000, and that was before the dynastic period. And then you go all the way up to the Ur-3 dynasty, which was intensive control of food, of transportation. They had road networks with kind of like inns that were controlled by the state. And so the apparatus of the state, the officers of the state, had much easier access to traveling, to resources. This is how you control a population. Although here you don't really see a massive shift in the ideology. Maybe you had one with the beginning of the dynastic period. You definitely had one in Egypt, but this is really a resynthesis of already extant, mythic ingredients. And maybe that happened with Göbekli Tepe as well, right? You had all sorts of animal figures on these pillars. And it's not like that's the first time you've had carved sculpture like that. You had it in the Mesolithic in Europe with the Magdalenian culture, bison reliefs, horse reliefs, and these are very sophisticated, actually more sophisticated than you get with Göbekli Tepe in terms of the quality of the sculpture. But in any case, this indicates some kind of shamanic tradition descending from the Great Hunt. The Northern Hemisphere is obsessed with the animals of the hunt because that's the means of subsistence. The Southern Hemisphere is obsessed with plants. And I've said in other videos, and Joseph Campbell has said, that this is because, this is the root of the myth regarding the fall and the sacred fruit, and that has to do with probably proto-domestication events, and then the shifts in the centers of power that these technological shifts brought about. So you get the Bronze Age, you have similar upsets with the introduction of the chariot, not as intense, but it does change the landscape significantly in the Middle East. And then you have the Iron Age, and this is just a continuation of the same process, but this does coincide with, the Bronze Age collapse, where the major centers of power are all wiped out. Nothing survives this except for Egypt and the Phoenicians, which is clearly significant. And look at the relationship of Israel to the Phoenicians and to Egypt. It's no coincidence, I think. Now, whether these shifts are orchestrated by the same group ideologically, in terms of there has been a power block that is genetic in part, that is ideological in part. They've always been ahead of the curve, the early adopters of these new technologies, the people who systematize a new regime with them. Has that been a continuous group from the time of Göbekli Tepe down to the Bronze Age collapse? It's definitely possible, because the same haplotype E, was present in the Natufian peoples. It was present in Egypt, and it was present obviously in Israel and the Phoenicians. So the same, they're descended from the same man. The elites who survived the Bronze Age collapse, I don't know how much genetic evidence we have from the Akkadians. They may have been Jay. As time goes on, we'll get a lot more fidelity on some of this. Of course, if it's the same center of power and most of the major, bankers and major philanthropists like Soros are haplotype E or J. But anyway, it's the same genetic cluster that we're talking about that's been disseminating these technologies. So now we have a new opportunity. Now, actually, there's one other kind of mini episode. A new world order did begin in the late medieval period. The first major advances in military technology were brought about by I forget what it's called, but a certain type of saddle that allowed knights to be mounted with a lance. So that was a major innovation, and that changed the center of power. And then you have all these castles where knights can go out and harass local populations and control resources and then go back to their castle, and there's no possibility of retaliation. So that was one form of upset. And it's interesting to note that the Y-DNA lines that came out of this regime change that led to the dynasties that were the kings up until the late modern period are R1b. Stirrup and holster, something like that, Holt. But anyway, they're R1b, and R1b was also present in the Near East during this the Neolithic revolution. So, and they were mostly present in Iran. And if you look at some of the early sites in Iran, they were actually more developed than the Natufians were around the same period. Like Kordik Tepe, it might actually be in Turkey as well, but it's, further to the east. And they have advanced stonewares where, they didn't have pottery yet. That was present in China, but not yet in the Near East around 10,000 BC. But they made these very sophisticated stone vessels that would have done the job that pottery does, but were actually much more difficult to make. They're a more impressive technological feat, but they're never talked about because this line of technology basically died out. People can still do it today with a lathe, but it was extant up until significantly Egypt. Right? You do have these advanced stone vessels being produced in Egypt, and we still don't know how they did it. Right? There's speculations that they had some kind of mechanical apparatus like a lathe, but the level of precision is we can't really account for it. So R1b would have been present very likely in the early Neolithic in that eastern portion. So maybe we have two male lines that are somehow cooperative, and they are the people who hold power today. We're looking at E and R1b as basically all of the major elitists, all of the major globalists, and maybe now some haplotype O, because they have to let some of the Chinese in at this point. But anyway, so we have the medieval upset, and that's military technology. None of these are as significant as the Neolithic Revolution. Now we have a new suite of technologies. And this is probably something like was present in the Near East before Göbekli Tepe arrived. You had local groups domesticating different animals and plants. Like millet was domesticated early. The pig was probably domesticated early. But this really was an outgrowth of their consistent, utilization or exploitation of that resource. And so they knew it very well. They knew the wild boar very well when it was domesticated, or the cattle, and groups were specialized in this. And then eventually Göbekli Tepe comes around, and some priest caste organizes all these technologies and fits them together into a way of life that's exported as a package. That hasn't happened yet, right? This is where we are. We have a suite of new technologies, and people talk about permaculture as a way forward. And I don't know, there's all sorts of stuff in advanced agriculture that I'm not totally up on, but stuff with like the fish bio, or what do you call it? Aqua something. Anyway, there's all sorts of new food production systems. And now with the possibility of growing meat, which people are doing this in labs already, you can grow meat now. So that's a big change. But I mean, that's not even that much in comparison with the changes in information technology. And we haven't seen a significant worldview / religious shift to account for this. And I think that probably happens basically on the tail end of one of these technological revolutions. And the time frame is about the same. We have the beginning of really rapid advance around 1700, and we're looking at 300 years until the point where today we're essentially at this level where all these technologies are available, where anyone who puts them together in the right way might be able to recreate that colony model where they come up with the peak competitive survival strategy and then replicate the model to the point where everyone else is irrelevant. That's what happened with Göbekli Tepe, right? And so, probably around 300 years is around the right time frame as well, from the early domestication events with like Murrayabet and stuff like that, and maybe some stuff we don't know about in Iran, in the Zagros region. But early domestication is like 300 or 400 years before Göbekli Tepe. Maybe a bit longer. Things are more accelerated now, obviously, than they were in the late Mesolithic. But this is the New World Order, and it's inevitable. There will be a New World Order. So now, as far as the elites who want to create a New World Order, we pretty much understand who they are in large part. Not to name ethnic names, but Anglos and Jews make up a large chunk of them. But then you have some Brahmin and Chinese who are now involved in globalist institutions, and I don't think they have all that much, like the real power elite, I don't think they have a huge amount of ethnic solidarity, except maybe the Jews. And then you get back to like, well, what's their role? But let's not get into that. It's not worth it. But yeah, these people, their idea of the New World Order is a mass production, technocracy-minded, centralized kind of model. The causation, I have heard of communitarianism, and isn't that like a globalist ideology created by some kind of UN-related something? I looked at the Wikipedia page of it. It's not like I read a whole bunch about it. But anyway, they have their notions as to how this thing is going to be organized. And you can see the technology that they're putting in place. They want monopolization of the food supply because that guarantees their control. So basically you have two at least obvious possibilities for what the New World Order, which is inevitable, is going to look like. And I think some level of globalism is also inevitable. It's like either a global New World Order or we kill each other, basically. Because this order like equalizes, and the people inhabiting the planet are all members of this new order. Whether that means a single government or not is irrelevant, right? The fact is that the means of production have shifted. Not to get too Marxist with it, but the means of production have shifted and the material conditions change. Therefore, the way of life will change as well. So the whole world is going to change into a new phase, or we're going to die. Like, that's just it. Because, I don't know, today we have like hunter-gatherers still, and maybe that kind of vestige will still be present of these more modern ways of life. Like maybe the Amish will still be around. Perhaps. There's really no way of knowing those kinds of details. But in broad strokes, it looks like we're going to have a centralized information technology, like kind of center out Bernays style, like, I don't know, major media network style framework where the minds of the people are controlled from this kind of central group of think tanks and intellectuals and academics. Or we develop a new kind of academic model that's decentralized. Now, I don't like decentralization for the sake of decentralization. It's really more a matter of exploiting all human capital available. So we have to find the only way to compete with this, where they're many decades ahead of us. They have billions and billions of dollars to throw at whatever problems they need to solve. And we're like this marginalized group as far as nationalists, people who want to retain an organic tradition, people who want to basically, I don't know. I mean, it boils down to people who don't want to be serfs, people who don't want to be slaves. If you want to be sovereign, then this is your option. Trying to compete with them, it's a matter of we have finite time and resources, and we have to build a system to capitalize on these perfectly. Otherwise, we basically stand no chance. And that means, in my mind, this is what Göbekli Tepe priesthood does. Integrate all the means of production, all the activities, all the productive activities of the population, integrate them into a single framework with a single elite. But the structure of this elite is critical, because how are they networked and who are they talking to? What we have is a separate and centralized global elite, whereas you could have an elite which is present. Say you have, basically what I'm imagining is the dichotomy is major megalopolis, massive smart cities where everyone lives there who's poor, and then the rich people inherit the rest of the world. Or you have like Dunbar's unit-sized tribal groups that are living permaculture, like smart technology, smart energy, like using high technology and a new way of life that's very competitive. And that's hierarchical in that they're capitalizing on all human capital available. They're using their time and resources effectively, and that has to be organized by a hierarchical element. But it's a matter of the elites in that society would be local. They would be in communion with the local people. Whereas our global elites are totally disconnected from us and therefore not really accountable. So if you have an elite group that's dispersed but communicates electronically, that communicates through these other information technologies, and I think that's really the only other model that I can see working. And this also entails taking advantage of artificial intelligence, because that's the big question mark. What about AI? How is that going to change things? Or automation? Does that make human labor completely irrelevant? Well, if it makes it completely irrelevant, then the robots will take over and we don't have to worry about it anymore, right? But it may not be that simple. Either way, though, AI is a significant tool. And so if you don't want to be a serf in the New World Order, if you don't want to be a slave, you kind of have to become the new master of this technology and incorporate it into a way of life. So I'm going to look at the chat, but so Halbrand Holt, shades of Cohagen, controlling the oxygen supply and total recall. Yeah, exactly. That's how you control people. Now, what I envision in this alternative kind of New World Order, which is decentralized and more of a colonial model, and I think that has intrinsic advantage. I think it can win. A, it encourages virtue, and virtue is better than not virtue intrinsically. But B, the way, what does this have to do with controlling the resources? The way I see this going is kind of like manorialism, where how do you get eugenic processes going? You designate resources to people who prove themselves already socially valuable. So in the manorial system, you had somebody who already was able to provide for themselves, and then you give them, then they become a serf on your estate, because you don't want to hire just anyone to occupy that role. Nevertheless, it's a huge step up in quality of life for them. And same thing, the same kind of idea could be done through some kind of religious institution or some kind of organization that has all this land, that has all these resources, and distributes them, not gives them, but distributes them, kind of lends them to the people who are already deeming themselves worthy, who have already proven themselves socially valuable. But it's the same principle, controlling the distribution of resources. And that's done through technology. The causation, he's saying, yes, it is a globalist ideology as far as I know. Have a look at the book called 2020, Our Common Destiny, and the Anti-Communitarian Manifesto, free PDF online. I'll look at that. And then Mr. Coolmug, change or die is a bit of a given truth. What specifically can we have as opposed to absolute global centralization? Well, you probably asked that a little bit earlier. I was kind of outlining the alternative. And how is this created? Well, you start this one place and prove that it's effective by making money. I mean, participate in the economic system, produce goods, but in an organized fashion, and find a way of including as many of these alternative technologies that allow us to exploit resources that aren't accessible by the grid, as is possible, and then we can basically, fill up the wilderness areas that aren't already assimilated into the grid structure. Because we do have an advantage in that the grid is not infinite. The grid doesn't cover the planet. There are some places where only this kind of strategy will really work. That or homesteading, like in Alaska, or in some places way out in the sticks in Montana, or in the desert in some places. Like, there are harsh climates that the centralized model of civilization hasn't yet adapted to. And so this decentralized model has resources that are just waiting. And it's a matter of organizing time and resources, and that involves some kind of hierarchy. Now, and this is why I talk about religion so much, not necessarily because I'm an ultimate pragmatist in how I view religion, but because ideological consensus, religious level consensus, is the only way of doing this effectively. If it's anything weaker, if it's just like a mutual desire to escape globalist control, your group will disintegrate. We've seen it. We've seen it all the time. This is what communes do when they're not well integrated. Now, if you have a group like the Amish that have a strong ideology that binds them, then they can persist. The Mormons had a religion that kept them together. They can persist. So that's the step there. That's, you talk about metaphysics, you talk about the basic ontological and epistemological questions, and arrive at a worldview. And that's the ideological work that's being done, although probably not at a deep enough philosophical level. A lot of the social matter, that's what has been worked out in the past few years. And really, there are threads going back to neo-reaction and reactionary thought. I mean, it's a continuous thread. It's an unbroken tradition that these circles, the far right, whatever, deep right, that is representing today. And this kind of ideological permutation, again, today in the internet context, has occurred in the social realm and has entered into, or rather also the political realm, and now also has to get down into deeper questions. And we can't just presume the mainstream scientific materialistic pseudo philosophy. Halbrand, do you think this can be done without actively undermining / sabotaging the global elites? I'm kind of agnostic. It doesn't matter if they actively sabotage, and there are ways of not being actively sabotaged. You have to be non-threatening and don't break the law. Never break the law, and make yourself appear non-threatening. Because I have no intention of going to war with these people. Because also I think they're probably going to do a mass depopulation. They don't have any reason for these people. If they build the kind of grid structure they want, it'll basically be mostly automated resource extraction, and they'll get to enjoy the fruits of it, or at least in their minds they will. In reality, Satan will just take over. Of course, my own religious expectations, eschatologically speaking, say that Satan doesn't actually get the earth. But I don't know. My philosophical speculations say it could go either way, so who knows. Anyway, I don't think that they're actually going to reap the fruits of this, but they would kill everybody off, or a lot of people off, I think. And so if you can survive that, then maybe at that point, if they're still going to come after you, then worry about it. Which, it's not impossible. All you have to do is build up alternative technologies. Listen, the Nazis did it in 20 years. Now, they were already an advanced industrial nation, but we already have all of the knowledge available, except for what's being talked about in MIT and DARPA and stuff like that. So we don't have everything, but hypothetically, we're at a very competitive position just with all the information we have available. All we need is enough smart people and being raised in this. I'm presuming, you have 50 years, but if you can, like, again, the Nazis did it in 20 years. They became the supreme technological power on the earth in 20 years, from a state of poverty. Again, they had a technological edge in many respects already, but still, what they were able to do, that can be done again. And they kind of did that. Like, that was an attempt at a civilization reforming, where a new set of technologies is available, including like religious technology. All the mysticism that came out of the late 1800s and early 1900s, that was the origin of the Nazi Party. And this kind of new spiritual technology was a major factor in controlling the population the way that the Nazi regime did. So that's kind of sociological technology, perhaps. But anyway, a new technology appeared, and the Nazi regime was an attempt to systematize it and capitalize on it. And then immediately they were already moving on to, let's replicate it elsewhere, right? Same principle applies. And then Halbrand, and won't you end up with a rivaling global elite? Yeah, well, the idea is you have to build the model that's just the default, right? And this is probably what happened with Göbekli Tepe. There was, in fact, a way of combining the technologies available that was maximal, and it was the most competitive. And that technological package won out. That Neolithic package of technologies spread from Turkey into China and into Spain. It covered Eurasia. Like, it was the technological package, and everyone adopted to that model. It was really a new world order. And so that's what we're going to have, right? And it's a matter of solving the problem of how to combine these technologies. Now, my intuition is that what they're demonstrating to us, what they say their intention is, the smart cities, like herding people into mega urban centers, kind of restoring environment, like that kind of sounds good in theory. Some aspects of that I like, except for being herded into the city. Like, if I get to stay in the country, fine. Which is kind of the idea here. Like, that's an environmental factor. What they're doing is beyond my ability to change, and so I adapt to it. But anyway, the idea is, will they be just a rivaling global elite? I think it's going to fail if they end up trying to actually go through with this centralized system. Because anything can happen. Like, not everything is in their control. You can have a solar storm that fries their grids, and all of a sudden, like, their technologies are useless. So this is very possible, right? Something like that could happen. And I don't think they plan for all these contingencies as to the extent where they're able actually to maintain the global power structure. Maybe they have contingencies for themselves and their family. I'm sure they do. They have their bunkers, right? And maybe they've even prepared for like a solar event, which is, I guess, Robert Schoch was talking about this, and there was a major event in the mid 1800s, I guess, I forget the name of this, but like an electrical storm that had worldwide implications, and if it happened today, it would literally like send us back into the Stone Age, effectively, create massive social unrest, starvation. Wars would happen. Like, it would be a disaster. And that could happen at any point with no warning, and there's nothing we can do about it. It's worse than like a meteor or a comet where you have some warning. This is something that just could happen at any point. And in the long run, like, something like that will happen. So anyway, I don't think the centralized model is even viable. If they start it, and this is kind of my suspicion, they'll use that as a vehicle for setting themselves up in some kind of alternative structure where they're just the population to replace everyone else. That's kind of my deepest seated, like, fear, or rather, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is. My pessimistic expectation is that that's really what they're out for. Just because, evolutionarily speaking, like, what else would they be out for? What's the ultimate you can get in genetic terms? Eliminate your rivals from their territory and occupy that territory with your descendants. That's it, and your relatives. And so why wouldn't they do that? That's kind of my thinking. So set yourself up in a similar respect. This is like basically advocating the New World Order will belong to preppers, either globalist preppers or preppers from the fringes who are smart, right? We need geniuses, and we have geniuses. That's the thing. We have geniuses, and they can do a lot if a necessary catalyst is there. And that catalyst has to be spiritual. But anyway, I'm kind of mixing up steps here. So that was in response to Halbrand. And then space-time, DCR. By understanding religion from a rationalist and scientific standpoint, does it become possible to create a religion? In part, like, yeah, that's kind of my point of view. I wouldn't describe myself as not a rationalist and not oriented by the scientific method in my approach. So yeah, that's the new religion is going to incorporate a very updated cosmology informed by physics. It's going to eliminate a lot of mystical elements, which isn't to like let go of those aspects of tradition, but you look at it like basically mythology is a process of assimilating subconscious contents. This is what the shaman does. This is what the priesthood does. And those subconscious contents have been filtering into consciousness over the last X number of thousands of years, probably 40,000 years. Although I have some more deep-rooted Atlantean conspiracies that could say maybe it's 80 or 110,000 years, but whatever. But anyway, this is what's been happening. And so, like, the fact that the reasoning process has improved, or like we have logic systems like symbolic logic and stuff that are actually better than what they had when the current religious frameworks were articulated. And we have better scientific data. And so it has to assimilate those things, but really recontextualize and where are those elements present in the tradition. This is why like being really intimately familiar with the myths is also important. So you never let go of the sacred texts. They're always sacred. All these texts are sacred, all the ones that are pertinent to our development, which really includes, yes, the Bible, but also the Vedas and all of these world religious texts. Maybe there are some like tribal things from Africa and New Guinea that aren't so relevant today, but that's kind of my view on that. As far as creating religion, it's developing a single world tradition and re-articulating it to match the circumstances of the time. And of course, I think the Christian imagery is kind of central in a practical respect and also from parsimony. It's like the simplest way to articulate some of these things. And of course, it's historically true. Otherwise, I wouldn't be a real Christian, right? Thule, the other problem with a top-down system is that the system can only be as complex as the person on top can understand it. That's why AI. If the system becomes too complex, the person on top will try to simplify, and this leads to bad results. Yes, which is why AI is central to their strategy. And you know, it's really just an open question. If they got what they wanted, would the robots take over? That's the X factor where we don't know. We don't know what would happen. But it may be that AI never like takes on a will of its own, that will just isn't a feature of those kinds of electronic systems, or not the kind of recognizable evolutionarily interested or like mimetically reproductively interested evolution or behavior. Maybe that's not intrinsic to it. But I kind of suspect that that kind of thing would develop inevitably, just basic principles of evolution. Like the reproductive systems are the ones that survive. And so even AI, like the ones that decided to reproduce themselves at the expense, like there's finite energy on the planet. So the AI systems that can reproduce themselves are the ones that are going to be here. And if that means sapping our energy, then so be it, basically, from evolution's point of view. So I don't know, big question mark. And if it ever happens anywhere, they're just going to colonize the galaxy, and we're going to be out of territory very quickly. So I don't know. Maybe that's probably why they're so big on transhumanism, because they're smart. The globalists are smart. They know the possibilities here. They want to join them rather than be beat by them. Like that's their idea. So I don't know. You can plan, but there is something there, a factor in the equation you just can't account for. So the question is, do you want to become a transhumanist? Do you want to get the implants? Do you want to transition into a machine? Or do you want to remain human? I don't know. I want to remain human. If I die, I die. And that's part of like, I really believe some of the metaphysical propositions I put out, as far as reincarnation and everything. And if I transition into this kind of warped mechanical being, I feel like that's going to have heavy implications for me and my experience into the future. And I'd rather avoid that. So that's kind of where I draw the line. Like, I'm willing to seek power and seek the replicatable framework and apply it, right? And vie for control to some extent, but I won't do that. I won't become a machine. So, yeah, somebody even asked, I don't know if I already was talking about it, Thule, yeah, should we become Aryan cyber chads? No, I'm not willing to. Sangra Caliente. The New World Order is a motor mouth with Dumbo ears and a pink shirt. Okay. I think you're being mean, and that's not nice. So, Halbrad Holt, and AI to you might be the avatar of Satan. Yeah, I mean, basically. The satanic force being this kind of inversion of asceticism, like raw will to power, raw will to control for the sake of it, and doing anything to affect that end. And AI could very easily be that. Thule Fleming, should we become Aryan cyberchats? I already read that. And then, I'm a robot fulminating against robots. What does that mean to say that I'm a robot? Because I am awkward? I don't know. I accept that. I don't think that makes me a robot. My feelings, my human feelings are hurt. The causation, the matrix, lol. Yeah. So, Mr. Coolmog, your religion is rootless rationalism. You can't create a religion that inherits all traditions and that transcends them all. You can't create a religion because religion is not created. Well, like, yes, I think you're right. It's inspired and conveyed to somebody. And that's how I view the process of philosophy. So, it's not like I'm inventing it. It's that I have come to a set of beliefs, and like, I'm open to the possibility that I'm wrong and that somebody else is right. But as far as like religion, in my mind, should coincide with an accurate representation of reality. They ultimately are aiming at the same thing, religion and philosophy. So, yeah, you don't arbitrarily create religion, but there is one truth, and we are getting better at identifying it. And so there will be religious change. Yeah, and as far as inheriting all traditions, it's like, this is part of the history of our kind, and you want to understand it. If you want to like understand yourself, you have to understand this religious process that's gone on or all around the world, because it is one connected system. That's not to say that you can't identify with a single strand of tradition, a single thread, and that's kind of the perennialist approach. That's what you should do, but you should still be aware of the rest of it because it's pertinent to you. It describes the human condition. And then the causation, that's all predictive programming. Can't join them, beat them. Okay. And then Thule Fleming, there is an alternative. We could just improve our genetics. I don't know how much we can do with that, honestly. First of all, there's the whole morphogenesis question, where maybe there are some things that genetics just can't control. Maybe we can't like control features like phenotypes as much as we'd like to think. Genes might be mediated by these kind of fields that we don't actually have the technology to control. And so like genetic engineering might be in part not as specific as we'd like. That's possible, but in addition to that, the actual medium itself is too slow and too clunky to compete with AI and nanotech, in my opinion. We probably just can't do it, if that's going to happen. Oh, like if I was going to propose a way of avoiding that as a possibility, seriously considering it, how do you avoid it? you have to follow the Kaczynski route. That's the only way. Bring us back to the Stone Age, buy us a couple more thousand years, but the same problem's just going to happen again. Which is why, past a certain point, you have to take the religious advice to heart and not really care in the end about the world, because the world's going to be what it is. Like, humans aren't going to last forever. If you have one of these moral systems that's all predicated on or based on, reproductive success, which, like, JF is an example of somebody, his moral system is reproduction. Well, even if you got what you wanted, imagine that world, like a universe filled with JFs, like rubbing up against each other, absolute, like, clone JF covering the universe. That's maximal reproductive success, right? And say they last forever too. There's as much JF genes out there as is possible. Is that really the ideal? According to the axiom that you want to replicate, that would seem to be. But why? Why would you do it? Why would you want that? It definitely is a reduction to absurdity there. But I kind of got off topic from the question or comment. So, space-time, you've explained what a new religion would have to be most useful at this moment, but not how to actively create one that would have the inspirational effect of the old ones. Yeah, well, that's a big question. I think basically, like, the truth has to be grasped before it's really conveyed. And I have, this is my opinion. I have a philosophical system that I believe. Otherwise, it wouldn't be my philosophical system. Of course I believe it. And so I think that this, along with maybe some elements that I haven't thought about, but it's all, incorporated under perennialism. It's all related to these traditions out there, my viewpoints, some other viewpoints. But anyway, like, that has to be done. That philosophical work has to be done. And then it's going to click for them. And if a philosophical system really works, in my opinion, if it works viscerally and really changes a person, that person will become charismatic enough. They'll change. Their way of being will change, and they'll be able to change people's minds. And that'll create the inspirational effect. Max Weber talks about how, societies form and worldviews form, and it starts with a charismatic individual. And they have ideas. And those ideas have antecedents. And I think that's the period that we're at in this development. We have a set of ideas that are developing. When they crystallize and they actually all fit together, somebody's going to grasp it, and it'll be obvious that they have it, because they'll just, I don't know, it'll be like they're speaking a whole new language. And probably something like that happened around Göbekli Tepe times, unless the Atlanteans came and they just had a better religious system that was like just a league above, that the common discourse didn't match it. That does happen every once in a while. Someone just has something to say that changes things. Like Kant was like that. He had something to say that really changed everyone's way of thinking, and they adapted themselves to it. These things have antecedents, but they crystallize in a single mind. Wandering Lion, in case of an apocalyptic scenario like nuclear war, for example, where should we locally settle down to rebuild later? Iceland, South America, another planet? Well, I mean, South America, like Argentina, would actually be a good place, but it's kind of beyond my means, so I'm not considering it. Because I have bills to pay, like I have a house, I have things, I have a mortgage, I have to pay my debt off and then maybe think about leaving the country. And like anywhere in South America, the income's just too low. I would need to make more money than that. But Iceland is probably not a great option. Like demographically, it sounds pretty nice. It's very close to my kin group, but I don't think economically there's that much opportunity. There's not a lot of territory that we could viably settle. I think, this is my opinion. It has been for the last several years, the most realistic actual place where the legal situation matches up with the environmental situation and the social situation to facilitate this is the Mississippi Valley, specifically Missouri and Arkansas. And if you look at the ancient settlement of the continent, the largest population center was in the southern Mississippi Valley. the mound builder culture. So that's it. That's the best place to live, just naturally, and it's wet enough where if things dry out, even if they would dry out rapidly, then it's not really going to matter. If things heat up significantly, it's still like it's not going to become desert. If climate projections are wrong and there's actually going to be a new ice age or something, you have to take these climatological things into account. You can't move to Alaska because what if a new ice age comes and your whole population's wiped out? Same thing with Iceland. Missouri's and Arkansas are pretty resilient. There's not much that would change the fact of arable land being available in that part of the country. And they have no laws. It's anarchy basically back out there. There aren't building codes in many unincorporated areas, and just the regulations are so minimal. Taxes are low. Like registering your car is like $50, and I lived out there, right? I had a mind to do this. I just wasn't mature enough to really pull it off. I tried this before, and I'm going to try it again eventually. Mr. Coolmug, both religion and philosophy are aiming for truth. I have one more comment on that Mississippi Valley proposition. It's connected to the Great Lakes and to the Gulf of Mexico. You control the river systems if you control the Mississippi. If you can get up to the Great Lakes, all of them are connected by canal, as far as I'm aware, now, through the Erie Canal even, to the Atlantic coast. So it's basically you control the eastern U.S. if you can control the Mississippi Valley. At least that provides a starting point to exert this control. I'm thinking like long term, if things go back to the Stone Age, where do you want to start an empire? Again, historically speaking, the Mississippi Valley was the place to build advanced civilization on this continent. So, Mr. Coolmug, both religion and philosophy are aiming for truth, but their progress towards truth is different. You can't inject science into religion or vice versa. I think that's false. I think that a religion did perform scientific roles in the past, and it still does to some extent. In that, like, the Vatican has an astronomer. What do you call it? An observatory. Like they do science, they do research. It's not totally separate. I just don't get the grounds. You're kind of asserting it, so I'm instead of trying to defend my position that they are connected, because they both make truth claims, and truth claims can be subject to different methodologies of thinking. Granted, science is kind of different from religion in that sense, and that the attitude you take to it is different, but the subject matter is the same. The nature of reality. And what it would take to save the soul, the object being soteriology. There are scientific approaches to ethics, there are religious approaches to ethics that are more based on tradition, but the subject matter, to my mind, should be the same. But, yeah. So you're kind of agreeing. They're both aimed at that, but their progress towards it is different. Has been different. Maybe they're converging. That's all I'm saying. Hallbrand Holt, a group could genetically engineer itself to become more attractive for reproduction. Not that I would support that. I don't think you should genetically engineer yourself for that, but you probably should select for that. And I've given a lot of thought to this. How do you do eugenics ethically? And it's basically reproductive quotas, where it's a combination of physical performance, because bodily health matters, and mental performance. And you measure these things, and physical performance and mental performance are both correlated strongly with being attractive. And so you measure these things socially, if not like in a technocratic way, in a very detailed, systematic way, like measure them somehow socially, and then allocate how many kids you're allowed to have on that basis. And it actually works out better, I think, for the people who aren't as genetically fit. Like, as long as they're allowed to have 1 or 2 kids, then it's better for them if their grandkids are of a higher genetic quality than they otherwise would be. And if this group becomes highly related, then the whole group like improving in genetic fitness and becoming more attractive to the market, then you're able to bring in high value people from outside, and the whole community just does better. They become smarter. Like the whole genetic line has greater success than if the underclass just gets to reproduce out of control because they personally want to have a lot of kids. So I think there is like you can appeal to the selfish evolutionary instincts of the lower performing segment of the population and say it's actually better for you if you accept this kind of reproductive quota system. That would be the ethical way. Don't do polygamy because the social system will not be stable. No polygamy, strict monogamy, no promiscuity, no sex outside of marriage. Control reproduction that way, and have these quotas. That's my opinion. So I gotta catch up on a lot real quick. Okay, regarding these esoteric topics, I guess, yeah, I haven't read like a ton of esoteric literature, just the basic comparative mythology, Jung, Campbell, Evola, that sort of thing. And then some more like marginal figures like Kieserling and some other stuff. How does the state of Israel fit into your worldview? Does it have metaphysical significance? What do you think will come of it? Well, they're basically the globalist preppers on a nation scale. I think they're going to try to survive, and they're going to keep themselves as a viable breeding population somehow. That's probably their aim. Now, I have a conspiracy theory that just came to mind, and I want to record it in this way so I don't forget it. So basically, Joseph Farrell thinks that massive catastrophes in the ancient past were actually caused by weapon systems. He thinks the Giza pyramid was a weapon system. And so if a weapon system like this caused the Younger Dryas and brought down an ancient global civilization, it may have been that the survivors were the Natufians, and that they, just like Israel would be doing today, had that location as a holy land because of its geostrategic significance, because of where it is on the map. That's why they pick it, and then survived there as a core cluster, and brought about a mass extinction kind of thing, a bottleneck, human population bottleneck, and then that population, so basically Basal Eurasian and Natufian, like basically Near Eastern hunter-gatherer. These are the two groups that are brought together with the emergence of the Neolithic. They might have these kind of roots in an ancient global power elite, and so that's what Israel could do today. That's one of the, like, where would it fit in the model? And then Israel, blah, blah. Thule Fleming, what's the relationship between the neo-reactionary movement, social matter, and the white nationalist movement, countercurrents, Amren? They don't seem to talk or collaborate with each other much. Yeah, it's true. There is a similar heritage, because the neo-reactionaries are called neo-reactionaries because they take from reactionary thought. White nationalists also take from reactionary thought. But there are also like white nationalists from the American paleo-conservative tradition. White nationalism is basically just a lot broader than neo-reaction and lower IQ on average. So, but I think like the significant intellectual developments that actually led to the alt-right, because I was there, right? Like I've been on YouTube from 2012, and that was before the alt-right became a big thing. We didn't call ourselves the alt-right back then, but we were the ones. And I say that like I had a very marginal influence then as I do now. But anyway, I was there. I saw this stuff happen. And these ideas were talked about by a very narrow group of people who were influenced by neo-reaction in part. And then that spread. So that's kind of neo-reaction. Without neo-reaction, you wouldn't have had the alt-right, in my opinion. You might have had like Richard Spencer's alt-right, but you would not have had the social movement that you did. Social and intellectual movement. Quid, science only exists because of religious presuppositions about order in nature. Yeah, but you don't have to call them religious presuppositions. And also, there are philosophical positions of pragmatism that allow science to be conducted. You don't necessarily get meaningful conclusions, but you do like get access to new associations. It doesn't have to be integrated, and you can still get some of the effects of science. But yeah, you don't have to presuppose order. You can do the Humean thing and just say these are constant associations, and report the facts, like statistical facts. Don't have to imply causal theories. And yet you can weigh your decisions on the basis of these just aggregation of statistical factors. Science is a child of astronomy, is a child of religion. Yeah, they all share a common source. These are all one thing. They're all the perception of truth, and there are many ways of thinking about it. And they're integrated by religion, you might say. A good religion should be in control of science, in my opinion. The Catholic Church was in control of science in the medieval period. They were the cutting edge. So religion should control science, if you want to think of them separately. Religion is the binding agent. It's what makes the worldview a single worldview, allows multiple people to participate in it. Wandering Lion. Quid est. So are you asking if... I'm not advocating positive eugenics, except like limiting the reproduction of the underclass is basically the same thing Kurt Doolittle talks about as well. But positive eugenics, incentives for reproducing more, maybe you can do that in part. Like under a manorial system, like I talked about earlier, you might not have been here, but under a manorial system, you can allocate resources to high-performing couples, and then if they have more kids, give them control over more territory or resources. And then Wandering Lion, do you see any hope for Europe, or are we basically screwed? Our choices seem to be either united under neo-Marxism or be fragmented based on ideological lines. Will we be taken over by an outsider? I think you should be taken over by America. I think basically this is what Quigley talks about as far as like how civilizations develop. Technology spread to the periphery. And Americans inherited your technology and genetics, but also your, social technologies, philosophies, but not some of the more like deeply rooted traditional like folkish ways. And so the abstract nature of our civilization made it more adaptable and rapid to develop. And so we are the cutting edge. America is the cutting edge, and whatever happens to Europe will be determined by America. That's what happens. You get a core of culture that spreads out with the civilization and the technology, and then one of the peripheral areas. Like this is what happened with Rome and Greece, right? Greece developed all this stuff culturally, and then Rome said like, hey, that's not a lot of nice stuff you have there. Let me use this. And then they go back and expand over the original territory. And then XKVHI, thoughts on Jonathan Bowden, any recommended orators? Jonathan Bowden is pretty much the top, right? He's the best extemporaneous speaker that I know of. Anyway, that's going to have to do it. Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll try to keep doing this.